Imagine for a second, just imagine being put on trial for heresy, right? Like facing execution by the highest, most powerful religious authorities of your day.
Oh, wow. Yeah. High stakes.
Yeah, the highest. And your defense, when you stand up there, it isn't a denial. You don't ask for mercy, you know? Your defense is literally, you cannot kill me because I am already dead.
Right.
And in fact, all of you sitting in judgment of me right now, you are just walking corpses.
It is, it's a defense that entirely rejects the whole premise of the trial itself. It essentially tells the judges that their authority, their physical power, and even their fundamental concepts of life and death are completely illusory.
It's wild, and that is exactly the paradigm we are exploring today in this deep dive, because the sources we've gathered, which is this dense stack of historical texts, theological analyses, and recorded student-teacher dialogues, they all center on the man who actually made that argument.
Yeah, his name was Syeikh Siti Jenar. He was a highly, highly controversial mystic operating in 15th century Java.
So, to really understand the weight of his arguments, you have to kind of look at the philosophical landscape he was navigating, right?
Exactly. Because born around 1426, as St. Ali originally, Siti Jenar was fundamentally a synthesizer of these massive competing worldviews. He didn't just study locally in Java.
Right, he traveled a lot.
He did. His education spanned Cirebon, Palembang, Malacca, and reached all the way to Baghdad.
Which means he was absorbing just a dizzying array of thought systems. Like, the texts detail how he integrated traditional Hindu-Buddhist asceticism, where the goal is often to renounce the physical world.
Right, to achieve spiritual liberation through, really intense, isolating meditation.
Yeah. And he blended that with high Sufi mysticism. And when we talk about high Sufi mysticism in this context, we're referring to figures like Al-Hallaj, who was famously executed in 10th century Baghdad for publicly declaring, "I am the truth."
Which Orthodox scholars basically equated with claiming to be God.
Right, a massive taboo. We are also talking about scholars like Al-Jili, who wrote extensively about the perfect man as a sort of cosmic mirror reflecting the divine.
So Siti Jenar brings those highly esoteric, radically internal philosophies back to Java. And inevitably, you can see it coming, his teachings collide head-on with the Wala Sangha.
Yeah, the Wala Sangha.
They were the established council of 9 elite religious scholars who essentially, they formalized and governed Islamic practice in the region at the time.
Okay, really quickly, before we go any further into the actual philosophy, we do need to clarify our approach to these sources today.
Absolutely.
Because the historical documents describe really intense, often bitter theological and political conflicts between Siti Jenar and the Wala Sangha Council, and our mission today is not to take a side in that centuries-old conflict.
No, not at all.
We are not endorsing any specific religious or political or philosophical viewpoint. We are strictly unpacking the concepts contained in these texts, just to give you, the listener, a clear understanding of what was actually at the core of this historical debate.
Right, because the conflict wasn't merely a struggle for, political influence. It was a fundamental disagreement about the ontology of reality itself. And the entire architecture of Siti Jenar's worldview rests on this single foundational pillar.
Right, the core of the whole thing.
Exactly.
And that pillar is the concept of Manunggaling Kawula Gusti, which, roughly translated, means the unity of the creator and the created.
Yeah. According to the texts, Siti Jenar posited that God is the single ultimate reality, period. There's no separation, there's no dualism.
So no God up there and humans down here.
Right. The human soul is not this entity created from nothing to just sit apart from God. It is a direct emanation, like a literal spark of that divine essence.
Okay, I have to be honest, I find it really hard not to view that with immediate skepticism. If an individual walks into a room and declares, "My soul is God," or "I am a literal spark of the divine," it sounds suspiciously like unchecked narcissism.
Well, totally. It sounds like an ego trip.
Yeah, like a human being just granting themselves ultimate cosmic authority. So how does this philosophy guard against simple, extreme arrogance?
Well, it's interesting because the texts actually anticipate that exact criticism.
Siti Jenar's framework represents the absolute annihilation of the human ego, not the elevation of it.
Wait, annihilation, so it's the opposite of an ego trip.
Exactly. He argues that what you consider your personality, your physical body, your social status, your memories, none of that is the divine spark at all.
It's just biology.
Yeah, all of that is a temporary biological illusion. He actually uses a really specific Japanese metaphor in the text. He says the physical body and the ego are just the waranka, the wooden scabbard, and the divine soul is the keris, which is the blade itself.
Oh, that's a brilliant metaphor. So the arrogance I'm picturing, the narcissism, that comes from a misunderstanding of what is actually divine. The narcissist thinks the scabbard is God.
Precisely. If you are walking around claiming divine authority to serve your own biological or social interests, you're just worshiping the scabbard.
And the scabbard is entirely useless without the blade. I mean, it's just a hollow piece of wood meant to be discarded eventually. The texts argue that you cannot realize the divinity of the blade until you completely stop identifying with the scabbard. The human ego is the barrier to the divine, not the vehicle for it.
I mean, think about that as it applies to you listening to this right now. Think about how much time we spend agonizing over our physical appearance, right? Or our social status.
Basically obsessing over the scabbard.
Exactly, obsessing over the wood while completely ignoring the blade inside. But how does someone practically separate those two things? If you are experiencing the world entirely through your physical body, how do you know if you're operating as the scabbard or the blade?
Well, think about the friction you feel when you are torn between doing what is socially advantageous for your career and what your conscience quietly dictates is the right thing to do.
Oh yeah, that happens all the time.
Right. In Siti Jenar's framework, that tension isn't just a metaphor. That is literally the biological ego fighting for its own survival against the divine spark that simply exists within you.
Wow. And that friction, that leads us directly into what I think is the most challenging aspect of his philosophy, because he viewed the physical body and the ego as a hollow scabbard, like you said, a temporary cage, and that led him to a really radical inversion of how we think about mortality.
Yes, the whole life and death inversion.
Yeah. The sources show he viewed our current biological existence on Earth as actual death.
Which is a staggering claim to try and internalize.
It really is. The idea that everything we experience, breathing, building relationships, creating art, feeling physical pain, that it's not life at all but a state of death, he's essentially saying the physical world is a graveyard, and we are all walking corpses animated by these trapped souls.
And true life, like the eternal and real existence, only commences at the moment of physical death.
Because the cage opens.
Exactly, because that is the exact moment the divine spark is liberated from the decaying cage of biology to reunite with the eternal reality.
I struggle with the existential implications of this, I really do. If being biologically alive is literal death, and the physical world is just a graveyard of rotting cages, why participate in it?
That's the logical next question.
Yeah, I mean, why not just entirely check out? Or act with complete selfishness, or even accelerate the end of the physical body if the biological reality is fundamentally worthless?
Well, you're not the first to ask that. His own students posed variations of that exact same question in the texts. If the physical realm is an illusion, why act morally within it?
Right.
Siti Jenar's response relies heavily on distinguishing between the mechanisms of the intellect and the conscience. The texts explain that the human brain, the physical senses, and the resulting intellect, those are all new creations.
New as in temporary.
Yeah, they're strictly biological tools that evolved just to navigate this temporary graveyard.
So the intellect is tied directly to the survival of the scabbard. It's built to acquire resources, defend its status, prioritize the physical body's comfort, all of that.
Exactly. The intellect, when operating independently, is entirely self-serving. It is the architect of jealousy, deceit, and violence, because it fundamentally believes the physical world is all that matters.
It thinks the game is real.
Right. But alongside that biological intellect, a human possesses a deep conscience. And Siti Jenar defines this conscience not as a product of social conditioning, but as the unmediated voice of the divine soul.
It's the blade humming inside the wood.
That's a great way to put it. The mechanism he proposes is basically this. You don't do good deeds to earn cosmic points for your physical avatar, or to, preserve the cage.
Right, because the cage is dying anyway.
Exactly. If you manage to silence the panic and greed of the biological intellect and let the divine conscience steer the vessel, goodness is simply the natural byproduct. Because a pure divine spark cannot act maliciously. Malice requires a biological ego defending itself. So doing good isn't a chore or a moral test, It's the inevitable result of the soul temporarily taking the wheel from the flawed biological intellect.
Okay, but if we apply that logic to the concepts of the afterlife, the traditional framework just completely collapses.
Oh, entirely.
Right, because if biological life is a state of death, and physical death is the return to divine reality, then the standard promise of a future heaven or a future hell, it doesn't fit anymore. So how did he redefine those concepts? Because based on the historical text, this is the precise fault line where his conflict with the religious establishment really fractured.
Yeah, the conflict was inevitable at this point, because the Wala Sangho, like most religious authorities of that era, they relied heavily on the orthodox promise of eschatological judgment. A future heaven for the obedient and a future hell for the wicked.
It's how you maintain social and religious order.
Exactly. And Siti Jenar systematically dismantled that tool. He taught that heaven and hell are not physical destinations waiting for us at the end of time.
Wait, really?
Yeah. He said they are acute psychological and spiritual states that you are experiencing right now in this physical world.
Oh, wow. And the sources provide some really specific illustrations of this, don't they?
They do. They describe a wealthy merchant who possesses massive political influence, sprawling estates, endless capital, but his intellect is entirely consumed by the physical world.
Right, he's obsessed with the scabbard.
Exactly. He is paranoid about losing his wealth, he's suspicious of his family, he's unable to sleep because he's constantly calculating his next advantage. Siti Jenar argues this man's not risking a future descent into hell. His current agonizing attachment to the temporary physical cage means he is literally inhabiting hell at this very moment.
That is such a modern problem, too.
Right.
But on the other side of the spectrum, the texts describe a profoundly impoverished farmer living on a remote hillside. And this man has no social standing. He has barely enough resources to survive the week.
Yeah.
Yet, because he has detached his identity from biological accumulation, he sits on his porch looking at his small patch of land with absolute, unshakable contentment.
Right. And that spiritual liberation from physical anxiety means he is currently residing in heaven.
I mean, you can immediately see why a religious council governing a massive population would find that worldview terrifying.
Absolutely terrifying. Because if heaven and hell are internal states dictated by your detachment from the physical world, then the clerics lose their monopoly on salvation.
Yeah, you don't need their permission, you don't need their institutional structures or their formal rituals to avoid damnation.
And Siti Jenar didn't just passively disagree with the establishment. I mean, he openly accused them of propagating a hollow religion. He argued that conditioning people to perform rituals solely out of fear of a future fire or desire for a future paradise, it reduces the divine to a transactional merchant.
A transactional merchant, right. And the texts capture this critique so beautifully with the analogy of the coconut.
Well, I love the coconut analogy.
It's so good. Siti Jenar observed people rigorously performing their daily religious obligations, but they were doing so only to maintain their reputation in the community, or to secure their cosmic insurance policy, basically. And he said, observing these people is like watching someone pick up a coconut and furiously chew on the tough, hairy outer husk.
They are expending immense effort on the packaging while literally starving themselves of the actual substance.
They completely miss the sweet meat and the refreshing water inside. And looking at that through a modern lens, it forces a fairly uncomfortable self-audit.
It really does.
Think about the structures in your own life, right? Like, we frequently find ourselves chewing the husk, maintaining the appearance of a relationship, or going through the rote motions of a career, or signaling virtue to our peers, while the actual core, the meaning behind those actions, has completely dried up.
We mistake the performance for the reality.
Exactly. But recognizing that you are chewing the husk is really only the first step. The far more difficult question Siti Jenar posed is, what is the actual mechanism for accessing the water inside?
Right. How do you actually do it?
Yeah. How do you bypass the biological intellect and allow the divine soul to operate? And to explain this internal psychological journey, he utilized a highly esoteric interpretation of the Quranic story of Moses and the mysterious guide Khidir.
Yes. So in the Orthodox telling, Moses travels to find Khidir, who is this figure granted supreme divine knowledge, to learn from him. But Siti Jenar strips away the literal history of it. He reads this narrative as a rigorous map of human psychology.
Okay, so it's a metaphor.
A huge metaphor. Moses doesn't represent a historical prophet here. Moses represents the human intellect. The logical, analytical brain that demands cause and effect and operates strictly in the visible world.
Okay. And Khidir?
Khidir represents the hidden divine spark, the pure soul that understands reality beyond physical logic. The texts note that they meet at a location described as the meeting of the two seas.
Which, again, isn't a geographic place.
Right. In Siti Jenar's framework, it is the precise psychological boundary where the physical conscious mind intersects with the infinite spiritual subconscious.
Oh, that's fascinating. So once the intellect, represented by Moses, and the soul, represented by Khidr, once they meet, they embark on a journey by getting into a boat. And the boat represents formal structures, right? Like religious laws, societal norms, the rigid rules of logic.
Basically, the vessel the intellect uses to stay dry and secure while navigating the chaos of existence.
But then, the pivotal moment of the story and the crux of Siti Jenar's whole methodology happens out on the water. Khidr deliberately vandalizes their own vessel. He pokes a hole in the bottom of the boat.
Right. And from the perspective of Moses, the intellect, this is pure madness. It is illogical and, frankly, suicidal to compromise the very structure keeping you afloat. So the intellect immediately protests. But Khidr explains that if the boat remains entirely perfect and whole, it will be confiscated downstream by a tyrannical king.
And the tyrannical king is the human ego.
Exactly. The human ego thrives on perfect structures. It uses strict adherence to rules and flawless logic to build a sense of supreme superiority and unassailable security.
So it takes over?
Yeah. If you never question the rigid structures of your life, the ego commandeers them. The act of poking a hole in the boat is the deliberate destruction of that false certainty.
Wow.
It forces the intellect to realize that the formal rules cannot save it. You have to physically let the water, the chaotic, unbounded reality of the divine, breach your defenses.
So the mechanism of spiritual liberation basically requires self-sabotage of your own ego. The intellect wants to stay dry. It wants to observe the divine from a safe, analytical distance. But Siti Jenar is arguing that you cannot understand the ocean by floating above it in a perfectly sealed container.
No, you have to let the water in.
Which means willingly experiencing the terror of losing your structural control.
It is a deliberate dismantling of the biological survival instinct in favor of spiritual immersion. I mean, you cannot reach the divine if you are desperately bailing out water to save the wooden boat.
This is so dense, but when you look at the entire scope of these sources, you really see a philosophy of radical, unflinching, internal transformation. I mean, we began with the premise of Manunggaling Kawula Gusti, the terrifying and beautiful idea that the divine is not a distant judge, but the very spark animating your consciousness.
Right, which forces a total reevaluation of our biological obsession.
Right.
Recognizing that the physical body is merely a temporary scabbard, a decaying cage that the intellect desperately tries to protect.
And it reshapes our entire understanding of consequence, right? Heaven and hell are stripped of their futuristic mythology and placed squarely in our laps today, dictated by our psychological enslavement to or liberation from the physical world.
And finally, it demands action. It requires the intellect to surrender its need for perfect structure, to stop chewing on the husk of societal performance, and to willingly poke a hole in the boat of the ego so the profound reality of the divine can flood in.
It's an overwhelming philosophical architecture, but there's one final concept from the text that I think encapsulates this entire journey perfectly.
Yeah, Siti Jenar often referred to a concept known as the Perbendaharan Tersimbuni, which translates to the hidden treasure.
The hidden treasure.
Right. Continuing with the metaphor of Moses and Khidr, there's a moment where Khidr repairs a crumbling wall in a village, explaining later that beneath that wall lay a hidden treasure meant for orphans. And Siti Jenar taught that this too is a psychological map. The wall represents the mundane, frustrating, and often agonizing barriers of our everyday physical existence. He believed that right beneath those very walls lies an immense hidden treasure. But it is a treasure composed of a frequency that the biological brain simply cannot detect. No amount of logic, ambition, or intellectual rigor can unearth it. It can only be felt by the blade, never by the scabbard.
So the next time you feel that crushing weight of the world, when the anxiety of your social standing, the pursuit of your physical comfort, and the endless panicked calculations of your intellect become too much to bear, pause for a second. Consider the architecture you are maintaining. Are you dedicating your entire existence to polishing the wood of a temporary cage? Or are you finally willing to let the water in, break the illusion, and tend to the blade?
That is a profound challenge, and it requires us to look far beyond the visible horizon.
It really does. Well, thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the sources. We hope this exploration gives you a new lens through which to examine the structures in your own life. Keep questioning the boundaries of your reality, and we'll see you next time.